My mother spent the last 11 days of her life telling us that something was standing outside her bedroom window every night, and we did not believe her. Not once, not even a little. We took turns sitting with her through the overnight hours, my sister Ginny and my brother Jason and me, and we'd hold her hand and check her morphine drip and adjust her pillows and tell her it was just the trees, just the wind, just the medication making her see things that weren't there. She would look at us with those sharp brown eyes that the cancer hadn't managed to dull, and she would say, in a voice that got quieter each day, but never lost its certainty, that she was not confused, that she knew what she was seeing, that he had been coming to her window since before any of us were born, and he was coming now because he knew she was dying, and she needed us to understand that he was real. We thought she was losing her mind. We were wrong. She was the only one in that house who knew exactly what was happening. My name is Brian Perry. I was born in 1965 in the town of MacArthur, Ohio, in Vinton County, which is about as far southeast as you can go in Ohio, before the hills stop being hills and turn into real mountains. My mother was Loretta Perry, born Loretta Hamblin in 1937, and she died on the 14th of October 2023 in the same farmhouse where she'd lived for 61 years, in a hospital bed that hospice had set up in the front room because she couldn't make it up the stairs anymore. She was 86 years old. She had lung cancer that had spread to her bones, and the doctors had given her 3 months in July, and she'd made it to mid-October, which was exactly the kind of thing my mother did. Outlast the estimate, prove the experts wrong, hold on until she was ready and not 1 minute before. The farmhouse sat on 47 acres at the end of a gravel road called Tar Ridge, about 4 miles outside MacArthur. To the east and north, our property bordered the western edge of the Wayne National Forest, which is 244,000 acres of oak and hickory and beech forest rolling across the Appalachian foothills of southeastern Ohio. When I was a kid, you could stand on our back porch and look east and see nothing but trees all the way to the horizon. No houses, no roads, no power lines, just ridge after ridge of hardwood forest, dark green in summer and blazing orange in October and skeletal gray in winter, stretching into the distance like an old spine of the earth itself. My father, Howard Perry, bought that property in 1962 with money he'd saved working at the Zaleski Lumber Company, a sawmill operation about 12 miles east of MacArthur that cut hardwood for railroad ties and mined timbers. He was 27 and my mother was 25, and they'd been married for 3 years and living in a rented apartment above a hardware store in MacArthur while they saved for land. The farm wasn't much to look at when they bought it. An old frame house that needed a new roof, a leaning tobacco barn, a hand-dug well, and 47 acres of mixed pasture and second-growth timber that had been logged hard in the 40s and left to come back on its own. My father wasn't a farmer. He drove the 25 minutes to the mill 5 days a week and spent his weekends trying to keep the property from falling apart. My mother ran the house, raised us 3 kids, kept a garden that fed us half the year, and managed the dozen beef cattle my father had bought, with the idea that they would pay the property taxes, which they did, barely, most years. We were not poor in the way that some people in Vinton County were poor. We had food and heat and a roof that didn't leak after my father patched it. But we were close enough to poor that I understood the concept personally before I had a word for it. My mother made our clothes until I was in middle school. We got 1 pair of new shoes a year at the start of the school term, and those shoes had to last. Christmas was modest, and birthdays were cake and 1 present. And I didn't think anything of it because every kid I knew lived the same way. Vinton County in the 1970s was not a place where anyone was getting ahead. The sawmills and strip mines employed the men, the schools and the county employed some of the women, and everybody else figured it out or left. My mother never left. She said the land held her, and I thought I understood what she meant. But I didn't. Not until after she was gone. Ginny was born in 1960, 5 years before me. She was the responsible one, the one who got straight A's and went to nursing school in Columbus and married a man named Keith Tucker, who sold insurance and wore a tie to work every day. Jason was born in 68, the baby, and he stayed close. He worked at the Hocking Valley Equipment dealership in Logan, selling and servicing farm machinery, and he lived on 12 acres about 3 miles from the home place. I was the middle child, the restless one. I'd left Vinton County at 18, worked construction in Columbus for a decade, then moved back in 93 when my father got sick because somebody had to help my mother keep the property together. I took a job as a diesel mechanic at a trucking company in Athens and drove 40 minutes each way, just like my father had done, and I lived in a double-wide on the back portion of the home place, close enough to help but far enough away that my mother and I didn't drive each other crazy. My father died of a stroke in 1997, quick at least. He was 62. My mother was 60 and suddenly alone on a property she'd shared with him for 35 years, and everybody expected her to sell, move into town, maybe go live near Ginny in Columbus. She didn't. She said she'd rather die in that house than live comfortable somewhere else, and she meant it so completely that none of us had the nerve to push her. She stayed. She kept the cattle for another 5 years before selling them off when the fencing got too expensive to maintain. She kept the garden going until she was 80. She walked the property line once a week with a walking stick my father had carved from a piece of hickory, checking the fence and the creek and the tree line like a ship captain walking the deck. She was tougher than stubbornness. She was bedrock. She didn't move because she couldn't. The cancer diagnosis came in April of 2023. She'd been coughing since January and had refused to see a doctor until Ginny drove down from Columbus and physically put her in the car. The scans showed a mass in her left lung that had already sent scouts into her spine and her ribs. The oncologist in Athens talked about treatment options, and my mother listened politely, the way she listened to anyone she'd already decided not to agree with, and then she told him she wanted to go home. He said he strongly recommended at least exploring chemotherapy. She said she strongly recommended he not waste his time or hers. She was 86 years old, she said, and she had lived exactly the life she wanted. And she was not going to spend her last months being poisoned in a hospital when she could be sitting on her own porch watching the tree line. She came home. Hospice set up in the front room. A hospital bed, an oxygen concentrator that hummed and clicked day and night, a folding table stacked with medications, a stack of clean towels that never seemed to stay stacked. The 3 of us organized a rotation. Ginny came down from Columbus every Friday and stayed through Monday. Jason and I split the weeknights. My wife, Tammy, helped with meals and laundry and the 1,000 small tasks that accumulate around a dying person like debris around a sinking ship. We settled into a rhythm. Medication at 6 and 10 and 2 and 6 again. Meals that got smaller every week. Sponge baths and bedpan and the steady, relentless dismantling of a woman who had been so strong for so long that watching her weaken felt like watching a mountain erode in real time. She was lucid most of the time. That was the hard part. If she'd been confused, if the cancer or the morphine had fogged her mind, it would have been easier to dismiss what she started saying. But Loretta Perry's mind was clear as creek water, right up until the end. She knew the date. She knew who was president. She knew which of her grandchildren was graduating this year and which one had just gotten a speeding ticket. She could tell you the price of diesel fuel and whether the Buckeyes had won on Saturday. She was all there. which made it so much harder when she started talking about the window. It began on October 3rd, 11 days before she died. I was on the overnight shift, sitting in the recliner next to her bed, reading a paperback Western I'd found in the junk drawer. It was about 1 in the morning. The oxygen concentrator was doing its thing. The house was settling and creaking the way old houses do in autumn when the temperature drops, and my mother was sleeping, or so I thought. Then she said my name. Not loud, just a quiet statement. Brian. I put the book down and leaned forward. Her eyes were open and she was looking past me, toward the window on the east wall of the front room. The curtains were drawn, the way they always were at night. Outside it was pitch dark. No streetlights on Tar Ridge, no moon that I could remember. She said, "He's here." I asked her who was here. She said, "At the window. He comes every night now. He didn't used to come this often, but he knows." I looked at the window. Closed curtain. Nothing. I asked her what she meant. She turned her head slowly and looked at me, and her expression was one I'd seen 100 times in my life. The expression she wore when one of her children was being dense and she was deciding whether to explain or just let us figure it out. "The one in the trees," she said. "He's been coming to my window since before you were born. He used to come a few times a year. Now he comes every night. He knows I'm going." I told her it was the morphine. She told me it was not the morphine. She said the morphine made her drowsy and sometimes nauseous, but it did not make her see things that weren't there, and I could believe her or not. But he was standing on the other side of that curtain right now, and if I had the guts, I could walk over there and open it and see for myself. I did not open the curtain. I told her to get some rest and turned the lamp down and sat in the dark listening to the oxygen concentrator and the creaking house and my own heart, and I did not get up and open the curtain because I was 58 years old, and some part of me was still afraid of the dark outside my mother's window. The next morning, I told Ginny on the phone. She said the same thing I'd been thinking. The morphine. Possibly early signs of terminal delirium, which the hospice nurse had warned us about. People near the end sometimes see things, visitors who aren't there, deceased relatives, lights, shadows, presences. It was the brain's way of coping with its own approaching shutdown, and it was common enough that there was a clinical name for it. Ginny was a nurse. She'd seen it many times. She said to just go along with it. Don't argue. Don't try to convince her she was wrong. Just be present. So that's what we did for 11 days. Each of us, on our respective nights, sat with our mother while she told us about the visitor at her window. She was consistent. It was always the same description. Very tall, much taller than a man, broad, covered in dark hair, standing just outside the glass, sometimes for hours, sometimes for only a few minutes. She said he never made a sound, or if he did, she couldn't hear it over the oxygen machine. She said he just stood there and watched her through the window the way you'd watch over someone you loved who was suffering, and you couldn't do anything about it. She said his eyes reflected the low light from the lamp in the room, and they were dark, and they were sad. Jason took it harder than Ginny or I did. Jason was the baby, the mama's boy, the one who'd never really separated from her the way Ginny and I had. Hearing his mother describe this thing outside her window every night upset him past concern about her mental state. He told me after one of his shifts that he was starting to wonder if she was telling the truth. Not about Bigfoot specifically, but about a real thing, some animal, a bear maybe, something real that was visiting the property at night and that she was interpreting through whatever filter the medication and the illness had installed. I told him that was possible but unlikely, and even if it was a bear, so what? She was dying. If seeing a bear at her window brought her comfort, let her have it. On October 8th, for 5 days after the first time she mentioned it to me, she said something different, She said, "I need to tell you children what happened in 59. I asked her what happened in 59. She closed her eyes and shook her head, just slightly, just enough to move the pillow. She said, "Not now, when all three of you are here. I want to tell it once, and I want all of you to hear it." I called Ginny. She said she'd come down that weekend, which was her usual schedule. I said I thought this might be more urgent than the usual schedule. Something in my mother's voice when she said 59 had made me think she wasn't going to have many more weekends. Ginny said she'd come Thursday, but Thursday was too late. On Wednesday afternoon, October 11th, my mother's oxygen saturation dropped below 85, and the hospice nurse came out and increased her flow rate and told us gently that we were looking at days now, not weeks. I called Ginny, and she left Columbus within the hour. Jason came straight from work. By 6 that evening, all three of us were in the front room with our mother, and she was awake, and she looked at us with an expression I will carry with me until I'm the one in the hospital bed. It was relief. The look of someone who has been waiting to say something for a very long time and has finally been given permission. She told us to sit down and not interrupt. She said she was going to tell us a story she had never told anyone. Not our father, not her sisters, not her parents, not a single living soul in 86 years. And she was telling us now because she was dying and because what was standing outside her window every night deserved to have its story told by someone who knew it. Ginny started to say something, probably something about resting, about not exerting herself, about saving her energy. My mother held up one hand, the gesture she'd been using to silence us since we were toddlers, and Ginny stopped. My mother told us that in the autumn of 1959, she was 22 years old and engaged to our father, who was working at the sawmill and saving for the engagement ring he would give her at Christmas. She was living at home with her parents, Willard and Edna Hamblin, on a small subsistence farm about 2 miles from where the Perry farmhouse now stood. The Hamblin place backed up to the same stretch of Wayne National Forest. Same ridgeline, same unbroken timber. She had grown up in those woods the way all the Hamblin children had, hunting squirrel and picking blackberries and knowing every hollow and creek bed within walking distance. In late September of that year, she told us, she was walking the ridge trail behind the Hamblin property, gathering hickory nuts for her mother, when she heard a sound she had never heard before. She said it was a voice, but not a human voice, lower in pitch than any man she'd ever heard, and held like a note drawn out on an instrument, and it came from the hollow below the trail, from a thicket of rhododendron and hemlock so dense that you couldn't see more than a few feet into it, even in broad daylight. She stopped on the trail and listened. The sound came again, and this time it was different, shorter, more urgent. And beneath the vocalization, she heard something else, a sound she recognized because she'd grown up on a farm and had been around injured animals her whole life. It was a sound of pain, labored breathing, the wet, ragged intake of something that was hurt badly and trying not to make noise but failing. She told us she knew she should have turned around and gone home. A sensible person would have. An injured animal in thick brush is one of the most dangerous things you can encounter in the woods, and she had no weapon with her, not even the hatchet she usually carried for splitting kindling. But she was 22 and had been walking those hills since she could walk at all, and she had never been afraid of anything in that forest. And the sound coming from that thicket was so full of suffering that she couldn't make herself leave it. She left the trail and worked her way down into the hollow, pushing through the rhododendron until she found the creek at the bottom. The creek bed was rocky and narrow, choked with fallen timber, and she followed it upstream toward the sound. It got louder, the breathing, the low vocalizations, and then the smell hit her. She said it was the strongest smell she had ever encountered, and she had mucked out hog pens and cleaned deer carcasses and lived in a farmhouse with no indoor plumbing until she was 16. This was different from all of that. Heavy, musky, dense, like wet earth and rotting leaves, and something alive and hot underneath it. Not rotten. Alive. The smell of a living body much larger than any body she had been near before. She came around a bend in the creek and saw it. He was lying on his side in the creek bed. You half in the water, half on the bank, and he was enormous. She said the first thing she processed was the size. He was longer than the creek was wide, and the creek was at least 6 feet across at that point. His shoulders were broader than any man she'd ever seen, broader than her father, who had been a big man. He was covered in dark brown hair, not black, not light, a deep chestnut brown that was matted with blood and creek mud. His face was turned toward her, and she could see his eyes, and the eyes were what stopped her from running. They were brown, dark brown, almost black, but brown in the way that human eyes are brown, with whites around the iris and a depth behind them that she said was not animal. She told us she had looked into the eyes of deer and cattle and dogs and hogs and horses every day of her life, and she knew what animal eyes looked like, and these were not animal eyes. These eyes were looking at her the way a person looks at another person, with recognition, with assessment, with fear because he was afraid of her. She could see that the same way you can see fear in the face of a man who's been hurt and doesn't know if the stranger standing over him is going to help or make it worse. His right leg was the problem. She could see it even in the dim light of the hollow. A steel leg-hold trap, the heavy kind that bear trappers used, was clamped around his ankle just above the foot. The jaws had bitten through the hair and into the flesh, and the skin around the metal was swollen and dark with dried blood. A length of chain ran from the trap to a stake driven into the creek bank, and the stake had held. He had pulled against it hard enough to gouge a trench in the mud 3 feet long, but the chain had not broken and the stake had not given. She didn't know how long he had been there. The blood was dark and crusted, not fresh. At least a day, maybe 2. She stood at the edge of the water, maybe 10 feet from him, and she did not run. She told us that the decision not to run was not bravery. It was the realization, immediate and total, that this was a living thing caught in a steel trap and suffering, and that she could either free it or she could leave it to die, and she was not the kind of person who left anything to die if she could prevent it. She had freed a doe from a fence tangle when she was 11. She had cut a coonhound loose from a snare her neighbor had set illegally along the property line. She was a Hamblin woman, and Hamblin women did not turn their backs on suffering, no matter what shape the suffering came in. She said she spoke to him the way she'd speak to a frightened horse. Low, steady, no sudden movements. She told him she could see he was hurt. She told him she wasn't going to do anything he didn't want her to do. She said she sat down on a rock at the edge of the creek, about 8 feet away, and just talked. Told him her name. Told him about the hickory nuts she was supposed to be gathering. And told him about her mother's hickory nut cake and how it was the best thing she'd ever eaten, and how her mother would never write down the recipe, because she said if you couldn't learn it by watching, then you didn't deserve to make it. She talked for 20 minutes, she said, and in that time his breathing changed, slowed. The tension in his body eased just slightly, the way it does in any living thing when it decides that the presence near it is not a threat. She said he never took his eyes off her. She said his hands were enormous, twice the size of her father's, with thick fingers and broad, flat nails, and he was gripping the creek bank with one hand like he was bracing himself against the pain. She told us she went home. She came back the next morning with supplies: a pair of her father's heavy leather work gloves, a pry bar from the tool shed, a jug of water, a bottle of iodine, clean cotton strips torn from an old bed sheet, and a hacksaw because she didn't know if the pry bar would be enough to spring the trap. He was still there. The trap had held. His eyes tracked her when she appeared at the bend in the creek, but there was less fear in them now. Recognition, she said. He remembered her. She told us it took her 2 hours to free him. The trap was old, heavy, the kind her father called a wolf trap, with jaws that needed serious force to compress. Her father's pry bar was too short to get a good bite on it. She had to wedge it between the jaws and stand on one arm of the trap while pulling the bar with both hands, and even then the steel barely moved. She talked to him the whole time, told him her name, told him about the hickory nuts. Now told him about her mother's hickory nut cake. He watched her work with those brown eyes and never moved, though his hands gripped the creek bank hard enough to pull loose stones from the mud. On the third attempt, the jaws opened enough for him to pull his foot free. The ankle was badly torn but not broken. She poured iodine over the wounds, which must have burned terribly, and he made that low sound again, deep in his chest. But he held still while she wrapped the cotton strips around the punctures and tied them tight. She left the water jug and the rest of the cotton beside him and went home. She came back the next day, and the next. She brought food, apples from the tree in the yard, cold biscuits, strips of dried venison from the smokehouse. He ate everything. By the third day, the fear was gone from his eyes entirely, replaced by something she described as attention. He watched her like you'd watch someone you are trying to understand. When she spoke, his head would tilt slightly, like a dog that hears a familiar word embedded in a sentence it can't parse. She said she started naming things for him like you'd teach a child. Water, rock, tree, hand. She'd point and say the word, and he would look at what she was pointing to, and she could see him processing it, filing it, though he never spoke back. Not in words. He made sounds, low vocalizations that varied in pitch and duration. She learned to distinguish some of them, one that meant he was in pain, one that seemed to be a greeting when she appeared at the bend in the creek, one that was softer, quieter, that he made when she was leaving, and that she interpreted, maybe foolishly, she said, as reluctance to see her go. The ankle healed faster than any wound she'd ever seen. By the 5th day, the swelling was down by half and the punctures were closing. By the 8th day, he was putting weight on it. By the 10th day, he was standing, and standing he was terrifying and magnificent, and unlike anything her mind had any category for. She guessed he was close to 8 feet tall. His shoulders were wider than the doorway of her parents' house. His arms hung well past his hips, and the muscles beneath the dark brown hair moved like water over stone, powerful and continuous and unhurried. He left on the 12th day. She came down to the creek bed in the morning with her usual provisions, and he was gone. The jug was set upright on the rock where she'd been sitting for nearly 2 weeks. The cotton strips she'd wrapped around his ankle were folded beside it, and next to them, arranged in a precise row, were 7 hickory nuts, still in their husks. She had mentioned the hickory nuts once, on the first day, when she'd been talking to calm him down. My mother paused at this point in her story and looked at the 3 of us. We were sitting in her dying room, in chairs we'd dragged in from the kitchen, and none of us were breathing right. The oxygen concentrator was the loudest sound in the house. I could hear a truck on the county road half a mile away, downshifting for the grade. She said, he remembered the hickory nuts. From one conversation on the first day, when he was in so much pain he could barely keep his eyes open, he remembered. Ginny said, Mama, who are you talking about? My mother looked at her daughter, her firstborn, the registered nurse with the practical mind and the unwavering faith in the medical world, and she said, I'm talking about the Sasquatch who is standing outside that window right now, Virginia. I'm talking about the same one who has been standing outside my window every autumn for 64 years. I'm talking about the one who left hickory nuts on my porch. every October for as long as I lived in this house, and your father thought it was squirrels, and I let him think that because the truth would have broken his understanding of the world, and I loved your father too much to do that to him." Nobody spoke. The oxygen machine clicked and hummed. My mother's eyes went from Ginny to me to Jason and back to Ginny, and I saw something in her face that I had never seen in 58 years of being her son. I saw her deciding whether to trust us. She must have decided yes, because she kept going. She told us that after he left the creek bed in 59, she didn't see him again for 7 months. She married our father in December of that year, moved to the Perry farm in 62, and settled into the life of a young wife in a rural county with no money and no prospects, and a husband who worked himself half to death at the sawmill, because it was the only steady work within driving distance. She thought about the hollow and the creek bed and the brown eyes and the hickory nuts more often than she wanted to admit, but she filed it away like people file away things that don't fit the shape of their daily lives. Unexplained, unrepeated, done. Then, in June of 1960, she found the hickory nuts. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the farmhouse, 6 months pregnant with Ginny, when she looked down and saw 3 hickory nuts placed in a neat triangle on the flat rock at the base of the clothesline post. They were fresh, not from the fall harvest, which meant someone had stored them. Someone had kept them through the winter and placed them here, on this property, 4 miles from the creek bed, where she had spent 12 days saving the life of something the world said didn't exist. She looked at the tree line, 200 yards of open pasture between the house and the edge of the Wayne National Forest. Nothing visible, no movement, but she felt it, the attention, the same focused, watchful presence she had felt in the hollow, the awareness of being observed by something that was very good at not being seen. She picked up the hickory nuts. She held them in her palm. She looked at the trees, and she said out loud, in the same steady voice she'd used in the creek bed, "Thank you." 2 weeks later, Ginny was born. The birth happened at home because there was no time to get to the hospital in Athens. The midwife, a woman named Doris Shook, who had been delivering babies in Vinton County since the Depression, came out to the farmhouse and got there just in time. Our father was at the mill and didn't make it home until after Ginny had arrived. The birth was uncomplicated. Ginny was 7 pounds, 4 ounces, healthy, loud, and angry about having been evicted from the only home she'd known. That night, my mother was lying in bed with Ginny nursing at her breast, exhausted and sore and flooded with the joy and terror that comes with holding your first child, and she heard something outside the bedroom window. Not a knock, not a tap, a presence, a change in the quality of the air on the other side of the glass. She turned her head and looked at the window, and through the thin cotton curtain, she saw a shadow, tall, broad, standing still on the other side of the glass, backlit by the faint glow of a quarter moon. And from outside, through the closed window, she heard a sound. One low note held for 4 or 5 seconds, so deep she felt it in her ribcage more than she heard it with her ears. It was the same sound she had heard in the hollow the first day, the greeting sound, the one that meant, "I am here, I see you, I know you." She said she lay in bed, holding her newborn daughter, and listening to that sound, and she was not afraid. She was not afraid because she had spent 12 days with the source of that sound, and she knew that whatever he was not dangerous, not to her, not to her child. She said she understood in that moment that he had been watching her since the creek bed, that he had followed her from the Hamblin property to the Perry farm, that he had placed the hickory nuts, that he was, in his way, keeping watch. My mother looked at Ginny across the dying room and said, "The night you were born was the first time he came to the window. He came the night Brian was born. He came the night Jason was born." He came the night every one of my grandchildren was born, though by then he had to travel farther because you children scattered across the state and he couldn't always get close. But for every birth that happened in this house, he was there, at that window. Making that sound, she paused. Her breathing was labored. The effort of talking this long was costing her something we could all see. Jason said, "Mama, are you telling us Bigfoot came to our house?" My mother closed her eyes. She said, "I'm telling you that a living thing that I helped in 1959 has been watching over this family for 64 years. I'm telling you he is real. I'm telling you he is intelligent and he has a memory and he has loyalty and he comes to my window every autumn and leaves hickory nuts on the porch every October. And he has never, not once, in 64 years, done anything to harm me or any of you. And I'm telling you he is outside that window right now, and he is not leaving, and he will not leave until I do, because that is the kind of thing he is. That is who he is." She fell asleep after that. The conversation was over. The three of us sat in the kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and looking at each other with the particular helplessness of people who love someone and cannot reach them where they've gone. Ginny said it was the disease. The cancer had reached her brain, maybe, or the morphine was accumulating. She said terminal patients often fixate on a narrative in their final days, a story that gives shape to the chaos of dying, and that our mother had apparently chosen Bigfoot as her narrative architecture, which was unusual but not clinically alarming. I didn't say much. I was thinking about the hickory nuts. Every October, for as long as I could remember, there had been hickory nuts on the back porch, dozens of them in their husks, piled on the top step like a delivery. My father had always said the squirrels were caching them there, using the porch as a staging area before burying them in the yard. I'd accepted that without question, but sitting in that kitchen I started remembering details I had never examined. The hickory nuts were always arranged, not scattered, not random, placed in rows or clusters, or sometimes in a shape that looked almost purposeful, though I'd never let myself think the word purposeful, because purposeful implied intention, and intention implied intelligence, and intelligence implied something I was not prepared to consider. Jason said quietly, "No, I want to look out the window." Ginny said, "Jason, there's nothing outside the window." Jason said, "Then it won't hurt to look." He got up from the kitchen table. He walked into the front room where our mother was sleeping. He crossed to the east window, the one she always indicated, the one with the thin cotton curtains that hadn't been changed since the 70s. He stood there for a moment, and then he reached out and pulled the curtain aside. The window faced east, toward the pasture and the forest beyond. There was no porch light on that side of the house, no yard light, just the black rectangle of the window and whatever was or wasn't out there in the October dark. Jason stood at the window for maybe 10 seconds. Then he let the curtain fall and walked back to the kitchen and sat down and picked up his coffee and took a sip that I could see his hand was not steady enough to manage without spilling. He said, "There's nothing there." But the way he said it, the flatness of his voice, the way his eyes wouldn't meet mine, made me wonder if nothing was really what he'd seen. 3 more days passed. Our mother got weaker. She spoke less, slept more, and when she was awake, the morphine kept her in a twilight state where words came slowly and sometimes didn't come at all. But every time she woke and one of us was sitting with her, she would look toward the east window and her face would soften in a way that looked like recognition, and she would nod, just slightly, as if confirming to herself that something she expected to see was still there. On the night of October 13th, the night before she died, all 3 of us were there. Not by plan. Ginny had stayed through the week instead of going back to Columbus. Jason had come over after work and hadn't left. I'd been there since morning. The hospice nurse had come and gone and had said what hospice nurses say when the end is close, that her body was shutting down, that her breathing would change, that it might be tonight or it might be a few more days, but the direction things were heading was clear. We sat with her. The lamp was turned low. The oxygen concentrator hummed and clicked. Outside it was cold for mid-October, low 30s, and the wind was picking up from the northwest, rattling the old windows in their frames. Our mother was unconscious, or so we thought. Her breathing was the slow, irregular pattern the nurse had described. A breath, a long pause, another breath, a longer pause. The pauses were the hardest part, those suspended seconds when you couldn't be sure the next breath was coming. At 11:47, I know the time because I looked at my phone. Our mother opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling, then at the three of us, and her gaze was clear and present in a way it hadn't been for days. The nurse had warned us this might happen. A last rally, the final flare before the light goes out. She said, "Open the curtain." Ginny said, "Mama, it's cold out. The draft will—" "Open the curtain," she said again. "I want to see him. I want you to see him. Please." It was the please that did it. Our mother did not say please. She told you what was happening, and you got in line or you got out of the way. A please was her way of telling us this was the last thing she would ever ask for. Jason stood up. He walked to the window. He pulled the curtain aside, and I will tell you exactly what I saw, because I have told myself 100 times that it wasn't real, and it hasn't worked even once. Standing on the other side of the window, close enough that if the glass hadn't been there, you could have reached out and touched him, was a figure that I will spend the rest of my life trying to describe and failing. He was so tall the window frame looked like it had been built for a dollhouse. The top of the window was about 6 feet from the ground, and his head was well above it, and he was not standing on anything, just earth. The outdoor floodlight on the corner of the barn, 60 yards away, done through just enough ambient light to give shape to what I was seeing. Broad shoulders, massive arms that hung at his sides, a body covered in dark hair that caught the faint light and gave it back as a dull sheen like the coat of an animal seen at dusk. His head was large, with a heavy brow ridge and a jaw that was wider than any human jaw, but shaped like nothing I had a word for, and his eyes reflecting the low lamplight from inside the room through the glass. We're looking past Jason, past Ginny, past me, and directly at my mother in her hospital bed. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, I couldn't look away. Ginny made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that she cut off by pressing her hand over her mouth. Jason stood at the window with the curtain in his fist and his whole body rigid, and I could see him trembling from across the room. My mother, the only person not paralyzed, lifted one hand from the bed slowly and held it up, palm outward toward the window, a greeting, a wave, an acknowledgement that said, "I see you, I know you, I always have." The figure outside the window moved, not away, not toward, just a small shift, a turning of that enormous head, and for a moment those dark eyes left my mother and found me. He looked at me, directly at me, and the intelligence behind that gaze was so plain, so impossible to deny, that every explanation I had constructed over the past 11 days, the morphine, the delirium, the fixation, the deteriorating brain, collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. There was a person looking at me, not a human person, but a person. Someone with a mind and a memory and a 64-year history, with the woman dying in the bed behind me. He looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds. Then his gaze returned to my mother, and his expression, and I know how it sounds, to assign expressions to a face that wasn't human, but I saw what I saw. His expression was one of grief. He stood there in the cold October dark, this being that my mother had saved in a creek bed when she was 22 years old, and he watched her die. Because she did die. not in that moment, but close to it. He stood at the window for perhaps 5 minutes, and during those 5 minutes my mother's breathing changed. The pauses between breaths grew longer. Her hand, the one she had raised in greeting, settled back onto the bedsheet. Her eyes stayed open, stayed fixed on the window, but the focus was going. I could see it leaving, like a tide pulling back from shore. The three of us stood frozen in our separate places in the room, unable to speak or move, caught between the impossibility at the window and the inevitability in the bed, and we watched our mother go. Her last breath was at 12:14 in the morning on October 14th. A small breath, barely there, like the last whisper of wind before a calm. The oxygen concentrator kept running because no one had the presence of mind to turn it off. The lamplight still glowed, and the figure at the window watched until the end, and then, in a motion that was sudden and unhurried at the same time, like a shadow separating from a wall, turned and walked toward the tree line. He covered the distance, 200 yards of open pasture, in what seemed like seconds, his stride so long and so fluid that he appeared to be gliding rather than walking, and then he was at the edge of the forest, and then he was gone, into the trees, into the dark, into whatever world he had come from and returned to for 64 years. None of us spoke for a long time. Ginny was the first to move. She checked our mother's pulse, which was habit, which was training, which was the only thing her body knew how to do when the rest of her had shut down. She turned off the oxygen concentrator. The silence that followed was total. No hum, no click, no breath. Just the wind outside and the settling of the house, and the three of us standing in a room with our dead mother and the knowledge that everything she had told us was true. Jason sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, on the floor with his back against the wall, and he put his head in his hands and he cried, not quietly, the deep, ragged, full-body crying of a grown man whose entire understanding of his mother and his childhood and his world has just been dismantled and rebuilt in the space of 5 minutes. Ginny called hospice. She called the funeral home. She did the things that needed doing because Ginny always did the things that needed doing. Her voice on the phone was professional and steady and betrayed nothing of what she had just witnessed. When she hung up, she sat down next to me at the kitchen table and said, in a voice so controlled it was almost mechanical, "I need to not talk about what I just saw for at least 24 hours. Can we agree on that?" All three of us. We agreed. 24 hours became 48, became a week. They became the funeral and the reception and the parade of neighbors bringing casseroles and sympathy and stories about Loretta Perry. What a strong woman, what a good neighbor, how she kept that farm going after Howard died, how she never complained, never asked for help, never showed weakness. We stood in the receiving line and shook hands and accepted condolences and carried a secret between the three of us that pressed against my sternum like a stone I had swallowed and could not digest. The funeral was on October 18th at the Vinton County Memorial Chapel, standing room only. My mother had lived in this county for 86 years and knew everyone and owed nobody and had helped more people than she would ever admit to. The minister said the right things. Ginny read a passage from Psalms. Jason couldn't speak. I read a poem that my mother had kept folded in her Bible about a woman who loved the land, and I managed to get through it without breaking down, though it was close. After the burial, after the reception at the church, after the last casserole dish had been returned and the last car had pulled out of the driveway, the three of us sat in the front room of the farmhouse, in the same chairs where we had watched our mother die, and we finally talked about it. Jason spoke first. He said, "I looked out that window 3 days before she died. On the night I pulled the curtain back in the kitchen and told you, there was nothing there. There was something there. I saw it, the outline of it, tall, dark, standing in the pasture about 50 yards out. I told myself it was a shadow from the barn. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Yeah, I told myself anything I could think of because I was not ready to see what I was seeing. Ginny said, "Why didn't you tell us?" Jason said, "Would you have believed me?" Silence, because the answer was no, we wouldn't have. Not then, not before we all saw it together. I said we needed to go through our mother's things, not for the usual reasons, not for the will and the bank accounts and the insurance policies, though all of that needed doing. I said we needed to look for evidence of what she'd told us. She had described a 64-year relationship. 64 years leaves traces. If this was real and we had all seen it and we knew it was real, then there was more to find. My mother was not a woman who left things undocumented. She kept records of everything. Every cattle sale, every property tax payment, every seed catalog order, every Christmas card sent and received. Somewhere in this house there was a record of the life she had lived alongside the thing in the trees. We started the next morning. Ginny took the bedroom, Jason took the attic, I took the basement and the barn. Ginny found it first. In the back of the attic, behind a stack of Christmas decorations and a broken rocking chair, there was a green metal ammunition box, the old military surplus kind you can buy at any Army-Navy store. It was latched, but not locked. My mother had put it there on purpose, in a place her children would eventually find when they cleared the house, but not so obvious that a casual visitor would stumble across it. Inside the box, Ginny found 64 composition notebooks, black and white marble covers, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for 50 cents. They were dated. The first one was labeled 1959. The last one was labeled 2023. 64 years of notebooks, one for each year of the relationship my mother had described. Some were thin, only a few pages filled. Some were dense, every line covered in her small, precise handwriting. Together they formed a record that none of us were prepared for. I want to be clear about what these notebooks contained, because I've spent the last year reading them and rereading them, and I could talk about them for 100 hours and still not convey what it feels like to discover that your mother kept a secret journal about a Bigfoot for 6 decades. The first notebook, 1959, was the most detailed. It described the encounter in the creek bed almost exactly as she had told it to us on her deathbed, but with more detail and careful precision. My mother had drawn sketches. She was a decent artist, better than I knew, and there were pencil drawings of the trapped leg, the steel trap she'd pried open, the arrangement of the hickory nuts he'd left when he departed. There was a drawing of his face, done from memory after the first day, and it was both human and not human in ways that made my hands unsteady to look at. The brow was heavy, the nose was broad and flat, the jaw was wider than any human jaw I'd ever seen. But the eyes were rendered with a care that told me my mother had paid particular attention to them, and they were the eyes she described. Brown, deep, aware. The notebooks that followed tracked the ongoing relationship. After the creek bed, the first documented return was June of 1960, the hickory nuts at the clothesline, which she described exactly as she had told us. Then the birth of Ginny and the presence at the window. She described that first window visit in language that surprised me because it was tender. She wrote that hearing his greeting vocalization on the night her daughter was born felt like receiving a blessing from a church she'd never known existed. The visits were seasonal. He came in autumn primarily, September through November, when the hardwood forest was shedding its leaves and the canopy opened up enough to see the ridgeline from the house. He left offerings, hickory nuts, always, but also at various times over the decades, other things. A piece of quartz, smooth and white, placed on the back step. A bundle of ginseng root tied with a strip of bark left on the porch rail. A bird's nest, intact and empty, set on the windowsill of the bedroom where my mother slept. Each offering documented in the notebooks, with the date, the location, and my mother's interpretation of its meaning, which evolved over the years from uncertainty to a quiet confidence that these were gestures of gratitude, repayment, reciprocity. She saw him rarely. The notebooks documented only 11 full sightings over 64 years. Most of the visits were evidenced by offerings alone, gifts that appeared when she wasn't watching, placed with a precision that indicated hands, not wind or animals. But the sightings, when they happened, were described with an intensity that made the other entries seem muted by comparison. She wrote about his size, which she estimated at somewhere between 7.5 and 8 feet at various observations. She wrote about the color of his hair, which darkened over the decades from the chestnut brown of 59 to a deep sable in the 80s to a darker shade, streaked with gray by the 2000s. She wrote about his movements, always fluid, always silent, covering ground with a speed that defied his mass. And she wrote about his eyes, which never changed, the same brown depth, the same focused attention, the same look of someone who is watching over something he considers his responsibility. In 1965, the year I was born, the notebook entry for the night of my birth reads, in its entirety, he was at the window at 9:32. The baby was born at 8:47. He stayed until I turned the lamp off at midnight. He left 3 hickory nuts on the sill. 3 children now, 3 hickory nuts. He is counting, he is counting. Those 3 words in my mother's handwriting undid me. I sat in the kitchen with that notebook open on the table, and I put my forehead on my arms, and I stayed there for a while. Because counting means keeping track. Counting means awareness. Counting means he knew how many of us there were, and he was noting each addition to the family precisely enough to mean not just intelligence, but investment. The notebooks covered more than just the visits. My mother also documented things about our childhood that I had never thought about. How the chickens were never taken by foxes or raccoons, though every other farm on Tar Ridge lost poultry regularly. How our hunting dog, a beagle named Biscuit, would sometimes stop at the tree line and refuse to enter the forest, not with fear but with deference, like a dog that stops at a boundary it knows it shouldn't cross. How the deer never got into the garden, despite the absence of any fencing that would have stopped them, as though something had established a perimeter around our property that the wildlife respected. How I, specifically, used to wander toward the tree line as a toddler, and my mother would find me sitting in the grass at the edge of the pasture, staring into the woods, babbling at something she couldn't see. She wrote about that last detail with a question mark. She wondered, in a 1967 entry, whether he showed himself to the children, whether we saw him and didn't have the context to be afraid, or whether my toddler babbling at the tree line was a conversation with something my mother could only see at night. I don't remember any of that. I don't remember sitting in the grass staring at the trees. But reading it in my mother's handwriting, in a notebook she never intended anyone to see, felt like having a memory returned to me that had been confiscated before I was old enough to keep it. The notebooks also contained my mother's private reflections on what she believed him to be. She did not use the word Bigfoot until the late 70s, and even then she used it reluctantly, noting that the popular culture version of whatever he was bore no resemblance to the being she knew. She used his instead, a pronoun without a name, and she wrote about him the way you'd write about a neighbor you respected but couldn't fully understand. She speculated about his intelligence, which she believed was at least equal to a human's, and possibly different in ways she couldn't measure. She speculated about his lifespan, noting that after 60 years he showed signs of aging, the graying of his hair, a slight stiffness in his movements, but that he was still alive and active in his visits. which meant he had been an adult when she found him in '59 and was still mobile and functional 6 decades later. She wrote in a 2012 entry that she believed he was well over 100 years old, and possibly much older. She speculated about his family. In a 1978 entry, she wrote that she had heard a second vocalization on an October night, similar to his but higher in pitch, farther away, up on the ridge. A companion. She never saw this second one. But the notebooks documented occasional evidence of more than one individual, overlapping footprints of different sizes found in the mud along the tree line, 2 distinct vocalizations heard on the same night, offerings that appeared at the same time on the front and back porches, which a single individual could not have placed without circling the house. She wondered if they were his family, his mate, his children, his extended group. She wondered if they knew about her as he knew about her. She wondered if the protection he offered our farm was something he provided on his own, or something his people sanctioned. She had no answers. She only had questions, and notebook after notebook of careful observation, and a patience that lasted 64 years. I read all 64 notebooks over the course of 2 weeks. I read them alone, in the kitchen, at the same table where my mother had probably written most of them during late nights, when my father was asleep and the house was quiet, and she had only her notebooks and her secret for company. I read them, and I cried more than I've cried since I was a child, not from sadness, but from the sheer size of what she had carried. 64 years, not one word to anyone, not her husband, not her children, not her sisters or her friends or her doctor or a single living soul. She had carried that knowledge alone because she understood correctly that telling anyone would put him at risk, would bring cameras and hunters and researchers and media to this property, to these woods, to the private and protected space where he and his kind had lived for longer than anyone could know. She chose silence to protect him. And the cost of that silence was that her own children thought she was losing her mind when she finally tried to tell them the truth. Ginny processed the notebooks the way Ginny processes everything, methodically. She created a spreadsheet, dates, locations, types of evidence, descriptions of sightings. She cross-referenced the entries with weather data and lunar cycles and our family's own records, birth dates, hospital visits, significant events. She found correlations. The visits increased during periods of stress in the family. The year our father had his heart scare, 78, the notebooks documented more frequent offerings as though he was responding to a change in the household's emotional state. The year of our father's death, 97, my mother wrote that he came to the window every night for 3 weeks straight, and that his vocalizations during that period were different, lower, slower, what she described as morning sounds. Ginny printed out the spreadsheet and laid it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time and then said she was right about all of it. Jason didn't read the notebooks. He couldn't. He said he didn't need to because he had seen what he had seen on the night our mother died, and that was enough. But he did something else. On a Saturday in early November, 3 weeks after the funeral, he drove to the farm and walked the property line the way our mother used to walk it, with the hickory walking stick and a steady pace, and when he got to the eastern fence line, where the pasture met the forest, he stopped. He called me that evening. His voice was strange, not afraid, overwhelmed. He said, "Brian, there are footprints along the tree line, fresh ones. He's still coming." I drove out the next morning. Jason met me at the house and we walked the eastern fence together. He was right. Along the soft ground at the forest edge, in the mud and leaf litter where the pasture grass gave way to the tree canopy, there were tracks, large tracks. I measured one with a tape measure I brought from the truck, 17 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball. The stride between prints was close to 5 feet. The depth of the impressions, in mud that was soft but not saturated, suggested a weight well north of what any human could carry. There were perhaps 20 tracks visible along a stretch of fence line, about 100 yards long, running parallel to the property. As though something had been pacing the boundary of the farm the way a sentry walks a perimeter. We followed the tracks as far as they went and then stood at the edge of the trees looking into the forest and feeling the same thing our mother must have felt 1,000 times. The attention, the awareness of being watched by something that you can't see but can sense with a certainty that goes beyond the 5 senses you were taught to trust. I didn't go into the woods. Not that day. I couldn't make myself do it, but I came back. Over the following weeks, I came back again and again. I walked the fence line. I found more tracks. I found an offering, a small pile of hickory nuts, placed on the flat rock at the base of the clothesline post, the same rock where my mother had found the first offering in 1960. I picked up one of the nuts and held it and understood, for the first time in my life, that I was holding evidence of a bond that was older than I was and more durable than anything I had ever built with my own 2 hands. In December, I went into the woods, alone, not far, just past the tree line into the first 100 yards of forest, where the oaks and hickories gave way to a stand of old hemlock and the ground dropped off toward the hollow where, 64 years earlier, my mother had found an injured being in a creek bed and decided to help him. I didn't find the creek bed. It was too far in, and the terrain was steep, and the short December daylight didn't give me enough time. But I found something else. On a flat rock beside a seep spring, about 80 yards into the forest, there was an arrangement. Not random, not natural. A piece of white quartz, polished smooth, a hickory nut, and a small bundle of ginseng root tied with a strip of bark, the same 3 types of offerings my mother had documented across 6 decades of notebooks. I stood in the winter woods, 58 years old, a diesel mechanic from southeastern Ohio, who had never believed in anything he couldn't see and touch and verify with a socket wrench, and I understood that I was being watched, that I was known, that whatever had been standing at my mother's window for 64 years was now standing somewhere in the shadows between these trees, watching me the way it had watched her, with attention and memory and something that I could only call faithfulness. I left the offerings where they were. I went home. I told Tammy about the notebooks and the tracks and the offerings, and I told her about the night our mother died, and she listened to all of it, and she said, "Your mother always knew things the rest of us didn't. I just didn't know how much." Over the months that followed, the 3 of us figured out separately and together what our mother's secret meant for us. For Ginny, it was scientific. She wanted to know what he was, where he came from, how many there were. She read books about reported sightings. She contacted researchers cautiously, without revealing our mother's notebooks. She approached the subject the way she approached everything, with rigor and a refusal to accept easy answers. She said that what our mother documented was the longest continuous observation of a Sasquatch by a single individual that she had been able to find in any literature, and that the scientific value of the notebooks was beyond anything she could calculate, and that our mother, without intending to, had created one of the most important documents in the history of North American wildlife observation. For Jason, it was personal. He took over walking the property line. He found tracks regularly, especially in autumn. He started leaving things at the flat rock by the seep spring, apples from the orchard, ears of dried corn, once a jar of honey. The offerings were always gone within a day or 2, and sometimes not always. Something was left in return, a smooth stone, a feather, a bundle of herbs that Jason couldn't identify. He told me that the exchange felt like a conversation conducted in objects, a dialogue of gifts that said, "I am here, I remember." The relationship continues. For me, it was something harder to name. I started driving to the farm on evenings when I had no reason to be there, parking in the driveway and walking to the eastern fence and standing in the dark and listening. I heard things: wind in the canopy, owls, the distant sound of trucks on the county road, and sometimes, rarely, from far up on the ridge, a vocalization. One low note held for a few seconds, the same sound my mother had described in her notebooks, the sound she first heard in the creek bed in 1959. The greeting sound. The first time I heard it, I stood at the fence line and my knees went soft, and I grabbed the top wire to keep myself upright. Not from fear, from the sudden, brutal understanding that my mother had been hearing that sound for 64 years and had never been able to share it. That she had stood in this exact spot on countless autumn nights and listened to that voice in the darkness and carried that knowing entirely alone. The loneliness of that hit me like a fist in the chest. I have read her notebooks 5 times now. Each reading reveals something I missed before, small details. The year she noted that his footprints showed a slight asymmetry, the right foot turning inward more than the left, as though the old trap wound in his ankle had left a permanent trace. The entry where she described finding a depression in the grass behind the barn, shaped like a large body, had lain there for hours, and she realized he was sleeping near the house. The night in 2001, when she heard a sound she'd never heard before, a higher-pitched vocalization from much closer than his usual distance. Man, she looked out the window and saw not one shape, but 2, the second one smaller, standing close to the first the way a child stands near a parent. She wrote, "He has a child, or a young one who travels with him." The smaller one stood behind him and watched the house over his shoulder. I could see its eyes reflecting the porch light. It was curious, he was protective. He kept his body between it and the window. The same way I position myself between my children and the road when a car is coming. That entry is from 2001. My mother was 64. She had been keeping this secret for 42 years. And in that moment, watching through a window in the dark, she saw a parent protecting its child, and the comparison she reached for was her own experience as a mother, not fear, not fascination, kinship. Last October, a year after my mother's death, I drove to the farm on the 14th. The anniversary, I brought Ginny and Jason and Tammy and Jason's wife, Brenda. We sat on the back porch as the sun went down, wrapped in blankets because it was cold, the way only Appalachian Ohio in October gets cold. That wet, penetrating chill that the hills hold and the hollows magnify. We drank coffee and told stories about our mother that had nothing to do with the secret. The time she chased a rooster around the yard with a broom. The way she could identify any tree in the forest by the shape of its bark in the dark. The Thanksgiving she dropped the turkey on the kitchen floor and picked it up and served it without telling anyone. When it got dark, I walked to the eastern fence. Jason came with me. The others stayed on the porch. We stood at the property line and looked into the woods, and the woods were dark and silent and cold, and for a long time there was nothing. Then Jason grabbed my arm, not hard, just a grip that said, "Listen." From the ridge, maybe half a mile away, maybe farther, came the sound. One note, low, sustained, rising slightly at the end. Then a second voice, higher, from a different position on the ridge. The same pattern. One note, a response. Then a third voice, lower than the second, but higher than the first. From somewhere between them, another note, another response. 3 voices. 3 vocalizations in the dark October woods, above my mother's farm, a conversation between beings who had been living in those hills since before the first settler pulled the first stump, and who had, for reasons I will never fully understand, chosen to watch over a family of humans who shared their ridge. I stood at the fence line and listened, and I felt the tears on my face before I knew I was crying. Not from grief, not exactly, from the sudden full understanding that what my mother had known, what she had carried alone for 64 years, was not a delusion, not a story she invented to fill a lonely life. It was real, and it was ongoing, and it was, in its own quiet way, the most important thing that had ever happened to our family. Jason squeezed my arm and said quietly, "She wasn't losing it." No, she wasn't. She was the only one of us who had it right. I keep the notebooks in the ammunition box in the attic, which is now my closet because I moved into the farmhouse in January. Tammy and I sold the double-wide and took over the home place. And we walk the property line every week the way my mother did, with the hickory stick and a pace that respects the ground. The farm is ours now, the 47 acres, the house, the leaning barn, the eastern fence line where the pasture meets the forest, and the understanding that comes with it. I leave offerings at the flat rock by the seep spring, apples in autumn, corn in winter, the first strawberries of spring when the garden produces them. The offerings are always taken. Sometimes there's something left in return. Sometimes there isn't. The exchange does not require symmetry. It requires showing up. I have not seen him again since the night my mother died. I have heard the vocalizations 3 times now, always in October, always from the ridge. Jason has heard them too. Ginny has not, though she comes down from Columbus less often than she used to, and the vocalizations seem to happen late, after 10, when the forest has settled into its deepest quiet. But I have found evidence that he is still here. Tracks along the fence line in soft ground after rain, offerings at the rock, a depression in the grass behind the barn where something large has lain. And once, in March of this year, I woke at 2 in the morning and felt the same thing my mother must have felt 1,000 times. A presence, a shift in the air, something on the other side of the glass. I didn't get up. I lay in bed and listened, and felt the warmth of whatever was out there, pressing against the cold of the window, and I said, out loud, the way my mother used to talk to him, "I know you're there. She's gone, but we're still here. This is still your farm, too." The window was closed. The curtains were drawn. I don't know if he heard me, but I believe he did, because in the morning on the sill outside the bedroom window, there were 3 hickory nuts. One for Ginny, one for me, one for Jason. He is counting. He was always counting. My mother's name was Loretta Perry, and she was the bravest person I have ever known. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid plenty of times of plenty of things. The cancer and the poverty and the winters that lasted too long and the loneliness of keeping a secret that would have been a comfort to share. She was brave because she chose to protect something that couldn't protect itself from what the world would do if it knew. She chose silence not out of fear but out of love, the same love that sent her into a creek bed in 1959 to free something from a steel trap, something she had no name for and no reason to trust. She kept that love alive for 64 years. She tended it the way she tended her garden, with patience and consistency, and the understanding that some things grow slowly and need to be left alone. She never asked him for anything. She never tried to photograph him or record him or prove his existence to anyone. She simply showed up year after year, decade after decade, and the showing up was enough. It was always enough. I am 59 years old. I live in my mother's house in Vinton County, Ohio, on 47 acres that border the Wayne National Forest. I walk the property line every week. I leave offerings at the flat rock. I listen for the vocalizations on autumn nights, when the air is cold and the forest is quiet and the stars are bright enough to read by if you had a book and the patience. My mother told us she was not losing her mind. She was right. She was the sanest person in the room, right up until the end. She knew what was at her window. She had known for 64 years, and on the night she died, she gave us the only gift she had left to give. She let us see him. She let us understand. I don't know what he is, not exactly. The notebooks don't answer that question, and neither does anything I've read or heard since. I know he is real. I know he is intelligent. I know he is faithful in a way that most humans can only aspire to. A faithfulness that has outlasted marriages and careers and lifetimes and has continued without interruption. For over 6 decades, I know he watched over my mother and my family for reasons I may never fully understand, and I know that whatever those reasons are, they are rooted in something my mother did in a creek bed when she was 22 years old, a single act of compassion toward a living thing in pain that was repaid with a lifetime of protection. Some debts, apparently, are never considered settled. Some bonds don't expire. Some things come to your window in the night, not because they want something from you, but because they remember what you gave them, and the remembering is its own kind of devotion. My mother knew that. She knew it for 64 years, and now we know it too. The hickory nuts still come every October. I collect them and put them in a jar on the windowsill of the bedroom where my mother died and where I now sleep. The jar is almost full. When it's full, I'll start another one. He is still counting, and so are we.